from the bodies of slaves made into laws, prisons, and courts. Screaming white hot flames and agony, she challenged millions of headhunters.
Good morning. Here's the point. America as the carceral state, a system of government power that uses the criminal justice system to achieve its goals. There's a great piece in Consortium News entitled U.S. System of Prison Injustice. As we bump up against the end of the Biden administration, the author of this piece takes a look at this president's final year in office and his criminal justice legacy. How concerned should Americans be? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze these events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is the carceral state. Did you realize that America has the highest rate of people incarcerated? It's the highest incarceration rate among developing nations. The incarceration rate has significantly increased since the 1970s. And of course, we know about racial disparity as it relates to incarceration. What are we to make of all of this? Let's talk to my guest. He's a former CIA counterterrorism officer, former senior investigator with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He became the sixth whistleblower indicted by the Obama administration under the Espionage Act, which is a law designed to punish spies. He served 23 months in prison as a result of his attempts to oppose the Bush administration's torture program. He's the author of the piece in question, U.S. System of Prison Injustice. And he laughs when I say this, a really, really nice guy. John Kiriakou. See, there you go. John Kiriakou. As always, man, welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for talking about this very, very important issue that just does not make the mainstream media. We really should all be talking about this.
I agree with you 1,000%. In fact, I wrote my dissertation on the prison industrial complex and prison privatization. You open your piece as follows, quote, I wrote in October that Joe Biden, in his 4 years as president, did literally nothing to improve the situation in prisons and jails across the country, either through the Federal Bureau of Prisons, over which he has direct authority, or through enlightened policies that might filter down or set the standard in state prisons and in local jails. As we bump up against the end of the Biden administration, I wanted to take a look at this president's final year in office and what legacy he's leaving in criminal justice, end quote. John Kiriakou, what's the legacy?
Oh, the legacy is one of shame. It's one of pain and torture, and it should be one of embarrassment and humiliation for the fact that this president has done literally nothing to bring us in line with many of our developed nation allies and their incarceration programs. I go into bullet points in this piece, just to offer up a sampling of what we're talking about here. And I'll give you one example. This is FCI, the Federal Correctional Institution at Dublin, California. This is a women's prison that has now been closed. It was closed this year because the warden and at least a half a dozen staff members maintained something called what they called the rape club, in which guards and other staff members would pay the warden as much as $1,000 for his permission to rape female prisoners. And there was nothing that these women could do to protect themselves.
Wait a minute, John, say, please, I'm sorry, but
I know it's nuts, right?
Start that one again.
Yeah.
That one deserves
guards
paying the warden.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the warden is, I'll use this term very loosely because the prisoners aren't willing participants here. The warden is pimping out against their will women that are incarcerated.
And just to show you how sick this was, now most of these guys are going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. This has been a case that's been ongoing now for about 2.5 years. Even the prison chaplain was convicted of raping women. The chaplain. There was nowhere to go for safe haven for these women. And they were afraid that if they didn't submit to the sexual assaults, that their lives would be made even worse. And so they just submitted. Now, why was this able to drag on for so many years? And why has nothing been done systemically to make sure that this doesn't happen elsewhere? It actually does happen elsewhere. I say in the piece that, we've seen this happen in Georgia, in Alabama, in Pennsylvania. It happens all over the place. Why? There are a couple of reasons. First of all, and before I even get into some of these reasons, I want to talk about for a second something that you mentioned in your introduction.
Okay.
The United States has roughly 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prison population. And on top of that, just at the federal level, over the last 10 years, Congress has created 500 new felonies, not new laws, new felonies. So what I'm talking about is every year for the last 10 years, Congress has passed 50 new laws criminalizing something that a year earlier was perfectly legal. Now, do we really need that many felonies? Do we really need to have 25% of the world's prison population? There are people serving time in prison for simple, marijuana charges. There are people serving time in prison for catching fish that were too small to be caught and kept. I've actually written about this. There's a woman in prison who whistled at a whale and was charged with interfering with the feeding of a wild animal, which was a violation of the Endangered Species Act. I mean, we've gone crazy here with some of these
whistled at a whale.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories.
I have two questions. Did the whale file charges, and did the whale appear to testify against this woman in court?
No, and that's when the charges should have been dismissed. When that whale failed to show up, that should have
exactly, because you have a right to face your accuser.
Indeed. And that story is particularly egregious. I've written about it a couple of times. This is a woman who was an employee of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a component of the Department of Commerce. And she was a GS-12, which is a mid-level, employee, not making much money. She lived in Honolulu, which is very expensive. So she and a friend opened a business where they bought a boat, and on the weekends they would take tourists out on the boat and they would look for whales. Well, on one occasion, on one cruise, they came upon an orca, a killer whale, feeding on a seal carcass. And so everybody goes to the side of the boat and they're taking pictures. And somebody whistled at the whale, in some lame attempt to get it to remain near the surface so they could take pictures. A couple of weeks later, FBI, they come to her house. They ask, you have a boat? Yes. Did you take tourists out on the boat? Yes. Did you find the whale? Yes. Did you whistle at the whale? She said, no. Somebody did, but I didn't whistle at the whale. And she said, but you know what? I take video of each outing. So I turn it into DVDs and I sell it to the tourists. They came back with a search warrant. They confiscated all of her DVDs. Months later, they came back again and they charged her with a felony count of interfering with the feeding of a wild animal, accusing her of having whistled at the whale. This case dragged on for 5 years. In the meantime, she was fired from her job at the Department of Commerce because she had this felony hanging over her head. She lost her boat. She lost her pension. She lost her friendship with her business partner. She lost her apartment. And then she ended up taking a plea to a reduced charge. Well, this is typical of what the Department of Justice does. Is society better off, I ask you, because this woman went to prison for whistling at the whale? Are we safer as a society because this woman was punished for whistling at the whale? But at the same time, the reason these cases are pursued is because the laws are on the books. And these losers at the Justice Department get promoted by prosecuting you. They're not going to get promoted for not prosecuting you. This is how they get ahead in life. And so that's what they do.
Go back to, I interrupted you when you were giving some detail on the rape club, and I want you to go back and that is such a shocking reality. I wanted to be sure that you finished the points you were making about the rape club.
Yeah. So this is a particularly egregious case. As I said, it took place in FCI Dublin, in Dublin, California. And to me, the most painful thing is that, sure, these guys have been punished. They've gone on trial. I think there's one trial that's left to take place. But that doesn't address rather the systemic problem of sexual assault under color of authority in the American prison system. Yes, they shut down FCI Dublin. They transferred these women to other prisons. What is to keep them from being raped in these other prisons? Because as we see in the piece, and I cite very specific examples with links to the original reporting in each one of these bullet points, this is happening all across America. Now, why does this not happen in Norway or Denmark or some of our other allies, especially Scandinavian allies? Why does this happen in the United States? Why is it that our recidivism rate, for example, is 50%, where it's almost zero in Northern Europe? Is it because in Northern Europe, rather than put you in a cage, they put you in an apartment where you can learn life skills? Instead of having you just sweep floors one after the other, they have you in a training program where they teach you a skill. So when you go home, you don't go back to selling drugs or running scams. You go back to an actual job. Why can we not get this right when so many other countries do?
Well, part of the answer, I believe, because there was a time in this country where I like to describe it as we went from a rehabilitative model which is what you're talking about in Scandinavian countries.
Yes.
We went from a rehabilitative model to a strict incarceration model
Yes.
around the 1970s. So
That's absolutely true.
to your point, there was a time where you could be convicted of a crime, you were sent to prison, and you could get your GED, you could get a college degree, you could learn a trade, you could then, upon release, go back in or come back into society with a skill set that would enable you to earn a living and become a contributing, tax-paying citizen.
That's right.
But as we started moving into the get tough on crime, thank you, President Joe Biden, for the crime bill, among others, when we started to move to the neoliberal policies of prison privatization,
Oh, yeah.
then it became a revenue generator. And then I'll throw in one more point and then let you respond. I think there's also a direct correlation between the deindustrialization of the United States and the increase in the rate of incarceration. Because what are you going to do with these people who you no longer have jobs for? John Kiriakou.
You are absolutely right. And this is not a partisan issue. The Democrats are just as guilty of this as the Republicans are. As you correctly noted, this began at the end of the Carter administration. It took on a life of its own with passage of the 1986 crime bill. Thank you, Joe Biden, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. And, you know, the get tough policies of Ronald Reagan. It continued through the Clinton administration, through the Obama administration. So this is not a partisan issue. Listen, I was in prison for 23 months, as you noted. There was literally nothing available to prisoners to better themselves. The only thing that you could do was you could get a GED. You had to be working on a GED in order to qualify for your good behavior time. But most people have high school degrees or GEDs already. So, I mean, we're talking about a small handful of people, but you can't learn plumbing, electrical work, small engine repair, you know, carpentry. That stuff's gone. It's been gone since the 1970s. And so what you do is you sit in your cage all day long and just wait for your time to expire. And then you go home and you do exactly what you know how to do, which in many cases was to sell drugs or run Ponzi schemes or, you know, whatever it was that got you into prison in the very first place.
I'm going to connect another dot here, and that's immigration.
Yeah.
Because a number of the trades that you just mentioned those jobs are no longer, and I'm going to I'm making a generalization here to make a point. Many of those jobs many of those trades are no longer done by Americans.
Yeah.
They're done by immigrants. As you know, you and I both, we live in or near Washington, D.C. And one morning I'm driving through D.C. and I pass 4 different home renovation projects where concrete is being poured. In each instance, in DC, in Chocolate City, the people pouring the concrete, the people doing the brick masonry work were not African American. And that had me scratching my head saying, what happened? There was a time when we did that work.
Right.
How hard will it be now to find an African-American brick mason that's under the age of 60?
Right. And look at, you know, Anthony Bourdain wrote a book years ago. It was the book that put him on the map, called Kitchen Confidential.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes a point that 80% of kitchen workers in the best restaurants in New York City were from Ecuador. It's just a thing, especially sauciers. They're all from Ecuador. You mean to tell me there's not one American who can work in a restaurant kitchen? Why not? And now we're anticipating this second Reagan administration with what is expected to be a vicious clampdown on immigration, whether documented or undocumented. And who's going to pick the fruits and vegetables? Are Americans?
And see, that's a great question because, for example, a great number of nurses in the United States are from the Philippines.
Yes, they are.
In fact, the United States government has an agreement with the Philippines having to do with immigration of Filipino nurses. You mentioned sauciers coming from Ecuador. We have migrant labor, farm labor coming from there are certain countries that where people come from to fill certain slots. But when you listen to the immigration conversation, and folks, this didn't start out as an immigration discussion, but we are here connecting the dots.
Yeah.
These are the elements of the immigration discussion that nobody wants to discuss.
Yeah, and I'll add something too. In 2001, in the spring and summer of 2001, the George W. Bush administration had engaged in advanced conversations with the Mexican government to essentially legalize all of the Mexican undocumented workers in the United States, where they would be allowed to work here for 9 months out of the year, file an income tax return. They would have to go back to Mexico for 3 months. They would be given work visas and come back to the United States for 9 months. This was supposed to be an agreement that's essentially solved our illegal immigration problem. And then 9/11 hit. And the whole thing went out the window. The shame of it is the problem never went away. It's that the American government just never went back to the negotiating table. And here we are 24 years later, still struggling with this issue where there was a solution already negotiated. And we just pretended that it never happened.
Getting back to your piece, which folks you can find in Consortium News at consortiumnews.com, is John Kiriakou, U.S. System of Prison Injustice. I'm going to read this paragraph. California, at the demand of the Justice Department in September, paid $4 million to 5 victims of a former guard at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Another $450,000 to a former prisoner at the women's facility in Chino for rape and sexual assault. One of the guards, Greg Rodriguez, is facing 96 counts of rape, sodomy, and sexual battery. But because he resigned before being arrested, he's been allowed to keep his pension. This is I
had to read it twice before I even quoted it. Yeah.
What
nice,
is
nice society we live in?
What is at the crux of that? Is it the fact that we're talking prisoners and prisoners don't matter? B, we're talking female prisoners who, by the way, I still think women are the fastest growing demographic in terms of people being incarcerated.
That's right.
So what are the dynamics at play here in terms of why this goes unaddressed?
I think it goes unaddressed because for the most part, there's no fallout. We read about, for example, this prisoner that you just cited from the article. We read about FCI Dublin, but those are the exceptions. If this is happening at prisons at every level, federal, state, local, all across America, but we read about 6 guards here, 1 guard there, another guard someplace else. If the calculation among these guards is that they can get away with it, then they're going to go for it. And keep in mind, that to be a prison guard in the United States, all you need, literally, is a GED and no felony convictions. That's it. That's all you need to be hired as a prison guard. So we're not getting the best and the brightest in these positions.
In fact, I did some research on this issue a couple of years ago. West Virginia was trying to pass, well, in fact, actually, they did pass legislation to build a prison in West Virginia. And one of the rationales that they used for building this facility was jobs. That we're going to build this prison,
Sure.
and as a result of this, we're going to create however many jobs for prison guards. And what they found out was most of the guards, I'll put it this way, most of the applicants were unable to get employed because they couldn't pass the drug test.
Oh my God.
So because opioid abuse is a huge problem in West Virginia.
Sure.
And they wound up having to get the guards from out of state because they couldn't pass. So to your point, you're talking about a GED, a clean drug record, and a GED is all you need. And in many states,
still can't do it.
You still can't do it. Here's a question. Were you aware that according to reports, 12 men at Virginia's Red Onion State Prison allegedly set themselves on fire to escape relentless abuse or possibly worse?
Yeah, Red Onion is one of the worst prisons in America. It is it's what's called a hub prison in Western Virginia. Almost every prisoner is sent to Red Onion before then being transferred to another prison somewhere in the system. And they actually rent out cells to the Bureau of Prisons at the federal level. I had a cellmate when I was in prison who spent several months at Red Onion. He told me that there were 120 prisoners in his unit and one working toilet. And I'd like to make another point if I could.
Sure.
Dr. Peter Moskos, who's a professor at John Jay College, professor of criminal justice at John Jay College, and a 30-year veteran detective in the Baltimore Police Department, wrote a book called In Defense of Flogging. He doesn't really defend flogging. It's just a catchy title. But he makes a point that the Bureau of Prisons is really little more than an employment agency for otherwise unemployable, undereducated, rural white men. It's not an accident that these prisons are built in states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Kentucky and Texas, where there's literally no other industry. Yeah, that's it.
Hence the deindustrialization of America. Ohio.
Exactly. Ohio is another good example.
The deindustrialization of America.
Yes.
And so on the one hand, it becomes an employment opportunity, but now you've got to fill these beds with people to be incarcerated.
And when you are transitioning to a private prison system, there's a profit motive here.
Oh,
so you've got to fill every one of those beds, and you've got to convict more people, and you have to issue longer sentences because otherwise it's not profitable.
And to that point, I haven't looked at the numbers over the last few years, but when I did my dissertation, the cost was about $33 or $34 per day per bed. And or companies like CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, at the time, in many instances, it was written into their contracts a certain threshold of occupancy if the state dropped below a certain level of occupancy, then a kicker in their contract kicked in so that there was a certain amount of profit guaranteed to CCA and others. They had to meet a minimum requirement.
Right.
So whistle at a whale and you wind up going to jail.
And how do you cut costs? There are two ways to cut costs. Number one, you serve animal grade food instead of human grade food. And we can talk about that at length if you'd like. And
Please
number
do.
two, you cut medical costs. So if somebody needs a medication, tough luck. If you're going to get out of prison in the next year or two, they're just not going to give you your medicine because they're going to calculate that you'll survive the next year or two. And then once you're out, you're not their problem anymore.
Talk about the quality of food. I think it's Cisco.
Yeah.
That has and Cisco Corporation. If it's not you, I apologize, but I think it's Cisco that has the contract to provide food service to a lot of these facilities.
Yeah.
And the food is less than human grade.
You know, on my very first day in prison, my first full day, I arrived on a Thursday. On Friday, a guy who was in a cell across the hall from me said, "It's Friday, it's fish day." And I said, "Oh, good, I like fish." And he said, "Oh, no. You don't want to eat this fish. We call it sewer trout." And I said, "Oh, okay." I go down into the cafeteria, get in line with everybody else, and there are these boxes stacked up behind the serving line, and they're very clearly, obviously marked. It says Alaskan cod, product of China. So it's not Alaskan cod.
Huh.
And then underneath it says feed use only, not for human consumption. And that's what they were slopping onto the trays.
And you didn't read this, you saw this.
I saw it with my own eyes on my very first day in prison, and I never, ever touched the fish. But it's not just the fish. There was another incident. I had been in prison about a year, and every Wednesday was taco night, right? You don't want to touch these so-called tacos, but we got an all hands memo from the warden one day apologizing that on taco night a month earlier or 2 months earlier or whenever it was, we had inadvertently been served dog food instead of ground beef. And he said that this was not the prison's fault, that the boxes had been mismarked at the producer and they were sent out as ground beef. It turned out to be dog food. The company had been fined, and the fine went to the Bureau of Prisons General Fund. So we never saw any of that, that money. Now, that's not even the bad part of it, that we were served dog food. The bad part is that we didn't even realize that it was dog food because it tasted exactly the same as the garbage that they served us every other day.
So what did you eat?
I was very fortunate.
On Wednesdays, you couldn't eat the tacos. On Fridays, you couldn't eat the fish. I assume Mondays was pizza night. You couldn't eat.
Pizza night was once a month.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Tuesdays was chicken. It was just awful. I was lucky in two respects. Number one, I had people on the outside who could put money into my commissary account. And after my first year or so, I cooked for myself, just with whatever I could buy in the commissary, and whatever decent food was stolen from the guards' cafeteria and was sold on the black market. But number two, and I've written about this in my second book, I was sort of adopted by the Italians while I was there, and I mean Italians named Gambino and Lucchese and Genovese. And
those are real Italians.
Those are real Italians. And they had a crooked guard on the payroll, and he would smuggle in food for us. And so I actually gained 35 pounds in prison because I ate with the Italians every night, and we cooked real food.
That's
sick.
that is beyond sick.
Yeah.
I wanted to hit on this medical care issue as well, because there's another issue, which is the aging of the American prison population.
Yes.
You have people that are going in at younger ages, getting sentenced to longer terms. And so now you have people that are incarcerated that are now being afflicted by diseases of the elderly.
Yes.
And which is causing the system to incur incredible cost. So talk about this. This is a huge problem across the country, the aging of the American prison population.
Oh, this is so true. And this is an issue that almost nobody is talking about. We have extraordinarily long sentences in this country. And then at the same time, there's no such thing as gerontology in the American prison system. There's no doctor in the Bureau of Prisons, for example, who specializes in diseases of the aging. In fact, most of the doctors that are under contract to the Bureau of Prisons have lost their medical licenses or have been thrown out of other jobs. We had a doctor at FCI Loretto, where I was incarcerated, who had been fired from Cleveland Clinic and lost his medical license for molesting a child. And so he came to the prison, and he was our doctor. That's typical. There was a prisoner with whom I was friendly, and I've written about this as well. He was an Italian, and I ran into him one day, and he was complaining about a bad back. His back was killing him, and I said, "Oh, you should go to medical and have them, give you something." Well, all they give you 800 milligram Tylenols. No matter what your complaint is, you're going to get 800 milligram Tylenols. So he went, and they gave him the 800 milligram Tylenols, and he just continued to get worse and worse. Next time I saw him, he's got a cane, and I said, "Are you in that much pain?" And he said, "I've never experienced pain like this before." And I saw him again a few weeks later, and he's got a walker. And I said, "Buddy, you should ask to be taken outside to a real doctor." He said, "I asked, and they won't let me go." So I was working in the chapel at the time, and I went up to the chaplain, and I said, "Chaplain, can you weigh in with medical? This guy's in real distress, and they're not doing anything for him." Well, the next time I saw the Italian, he was in a wheelchair. And finally, the chaplain was able to convince the warden to allow him to be sent out for an MRI. They sent him out for an MRI, and they found stage 4 cancer all over his spine. And so he was dying in excruciating pain in his cell. And the warden went to see him one night and said, "I will release you on compassionate release if you sign a document promising not to sue the prison." And he said no. And just a few weeks later, he died there in his cell. And that is not the exception. That's the rule. People are dying after decades in prison of otherwise preventable or addressable diseases. And the Bureau of Prisons has done nothing to counter it.
Do you remember what he had been sent, what he was in prison for? The crime?
Yeah. It was an organized crime. It was a RICO conviction.
Okay.
And it was one of these things where, listen, if you rat everybody out, you can do 5. If you don't rat everybody out, you can do 30. And he said, "Well, I'm not a rat, and it's not really that serious a crime." It was like running gambling machines and an extortion racket or whatever. Like I say, they were willing to give him 5 years, and he ended up dying in prison.
Explain it. Somebody just posted RICO. If you could explain, I assume that's that Cherie is asking what does RICO mean?
Right. RICO is the organized crime statute. It's racketeering, and I forget what it stands for.
The C is for conspiracy.
Yeah.
The O is organization. Let me see if I can.
Racketeering and organized crime.
That's
something.
it. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is
RICO is an acronym.
Yeah, it is. RICO. Yeah.
Right. So just quickly explain.
What they did in the 1970s was Congress passed a law saying that they created this RICO law where if you talked about committing a crime, or if you committed several different minor crimes, taken together, they become a major crime. So if you're running a numbers racket, maybe you're pimping out women and you're talking about extortion. You squeeze people with high VIG loans. You might get a year for each of those, but taken together, you're going to get 20 or 30 or 50 because it's considered to be organized crime. Thank you. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Thank you.
Right. And also what it allowed the Department of Justice to do was to go after lower level. It was the Department of Justice trying to find a way in the 1970s to break the mafia.
Yeah.
And so what they did was they created I'll hit it again, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Right. It allowed the Department of Justice to charge lower level mafia figures with crimes of the family.
Correct.
So now you've got the whole idea of running a criminal enterprise. And if you were involved in any part of that chain, you then could become part of the murder that was committed, even though you weren't involved in any way, shape, or form with the murder. And they did this to induce lower level actors to flip on the bigger fish.
Correct. And that's how they were able to break, for all intents and purposes, the New York's 5 families.
Right.
You make these sentences so draconian, so long, that everybody ends up flipping. So this issue of never talking to the cops, never testifying, never turning rat, it's gone down into the history books. It's just not real life anymore. They all flip, because where once upon a time you were facing a year or two in Sing Sing, let's say, or even if you got 10 years, you were going to be out in 3 because of parole. There is no parole anymore. And you're not going to get a year or 2. You're going to get 30. I have a friend who was part of a methamphetamine ring. It was an organized crime ring. And he was the only person of 5 to voluntarily leave the conspiracy. He said, this manufacturing method's just not for me. And he quit. Well, eventually the ring was broken up and everybody decided to flip. He said he's not a rat. He's not going to flip. So everybody got 5 years. He got triple life without parole.
Ooh. That
on appeal was reduced to 30. He ended up doing 17, and President Obama commuted his sentence. But triple life without parole for making a little bit of meth. I mean, that's really a year or 2 in prison, but for the fact that it was a RICO predicate, triple life without parole is what he ended up getting.
As we continue, there's a piece in the Wall Street Journal. America's private prison complex gears up for Trump deportation bonanza. Private prisons and other companies that provide detention services are getting ready to cash in on what Trump has billed as the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. That includes scouring for as many detention beds as possible in their network of facilities. Your thoughts on this? Because I will say to those that are watching this, this is not only going to be limited to deportation.
Yeah, I agree. This is most certainly not going to be limited to deportation. There's a federal facility, a federal prison in the Southern California desert that was built in the 1990s with the anticipation that we would fill it because we needed more prison space. It's sitting empty now, and it's been contracted out to GEO, one of the big private prison companies, with the idea that the federal government has promised GEO to fill it. Well, fill it with whom? They're going to fill it with immigrants. And that way, GEO's going to make a profit, and they're going to pass the profit on to their shareholders, and everybody's going to get rich. And, these poor, hapless immigrants whose only crime is having crossed the border without a visa, who are here simply to work and to make money for their families and send the money back to provide for their families. They're going to be in prison for God knows how long. Could be a month, could be a year, could be 10 years until they're finally deported.
Why did you decide to, I'll use this term to make the point, pin this on Biden? There are those watching this saying, oh, this has been done through by administrations since the 70s. Why single out Joe Biden?
Because Joe Biden 2 years ago appointed a woman to head the Bureau of Prisons who was supposed to be a reformer. She was the head of the Department of Corrections in the state of Oregon. And they said, okay, we're going to clean this place up. We have this woman from Oregon. She's fantastic. She's new. She has all these great ideas. She completely turned around the Oregon prison system. She's going to turn around the federal system. And not only did she not turn around the federal system, she simply maintained what the federal system has been doing all this time. So she failed, just like the 3 different BOP directors in Trump's 4 years failed, just like Obama's failed. They all fail. And I don't know if it's because the system is so entrenched that it can't be changed, or if they don't have the stomach to change it, or if their own people see them as temporary placeholders and just refuse to carry out their reform policies. I don't know. My point in this piece and in previous pieces was that the entire system needs to be scrapped.
Cherie asks, where is Chino Prison? Chino Prison is in Chino, California, and I'm from California. And by the way, my father retired he was the Inspector General of the California prison system.
Wow.
He was one of the first group, I think it was 5 African in the late 50s, first 5 African Americans to be allowed to be a parole officer.
Wow.
In the state of California that had the authority to oversee white parolees.
Oh my gosh.
And when he retired, he was the Inspector General
and I'll tell you, the Inspector General is the only good guy in any of these systems.
My dad was a great guy.
There you go.
No, you're right. You're absolutely, because he was independent. He was a political appointee, and he was independent. But to answer Cherie's question, Chino is in Southern California. I think it's in the Imperial Valley. It's in San Bernardino County.
Yes.
In Southern California. So let's shift gears a bit here, because another issue that is very, very near and dear to your heart, and another element of all of this, is the issue of pardons.
Yeah.
And Joe Biden pardoned his son, Hunter. I believe 2 things. He pardoned his son because, as a father, that's what a father would do. Well, maybe 3 things. He pardoned his son because Jill would never have allowed him back in the house if Hunter wasn't able to come to the house for Christmas and Thanksgiving dinner. And 3, I think Joe Biden pardoned Hunter to take Hunter out of play to protect himself from Hunter being squeezed to flip on his father. Before we get into the bigger pardon issue, your thoughts on that analysis?
Oh, that I like that. I hadn't heard that. I hadn't considered it.
Well,
But
that's just me.
I like it. I like the idea. I've applied.
And you are seeking a pardon.
I am. I'm seeking a pardon. I've applied for a pardon. I have some strong support in the Greek American community, and I have literally zero indication that it's going to happen. Zero. Okay. Joe Biden issued a handful of pardons recently that just made me shake my head, including a convicted Chinese spy.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea where that decision was made, and an infamous judge from Pennsylvania who's known as the Kids for Cash judge. Now, you mentioned private prisons. There's a private prison in Pennsylvania for children, and the prison leader, the corporate leadership had bribed this judge to convict children of crimes, to give them long sentences so that the private prison would make more money. Mm-hmm. And they issued a kickback to the judge. He got 20 years, and this guy's like in his 70s. So this was a life sentence. He's only been in prison for, 3-4 years. And not only did Joe Biden let him out, he pardoned him. Now, this was so egregious that even the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, said, "Whoa, where did that come from? That was a mistake." Even Josh Shapiro was opposed to an action like this. So, there's no rhyme or reason to pardons. There's at the federal level, there's this office called the Office of the U.S. Pardon Attorney. It's supposed to be independent of the Justice Department. It's supposed to be housed at the White House. It's not. It's housed at the Justice Department. And what happens is you apply for a pardon. They send your application to your prosecutor and to your sentencing judge. And they say, "What do you think about this pardon application?" And of course, both of them say, "Nope, don't do it." And so something like 2% of pardon applications are denied.
Now, wait a minute. Let me ask you this to that point. Why would an agency that's supposed to be independent send the request to two entities that are anything but independent?
Exactly right. Exactly right.
That's hypocritical. That makes no sense.
I keep coming back to President Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln pardoned more people than any president in American history. And there are historical accounts of Lincoln staying awake into the night and just pardoning people by candlelight because he believed that the prisons should not be full of people. And indeed, one of his core beliefs was if you were a coward and you went AWOL because you were afraid to fight in the Civil War, that cowardice should not be punishable by death. And so he pardoned thousands of people. Well, the number of people Joe Biden has pardoned, you can count on two hands. Mm-hmm. And it's people like, the baseball player Dave Winfield, for example. Dave Winfield, didn't pay his taxes 40 years ago. Okay, he gets a pardon. Well, that's not controversial. Like Dave Winfield doesn't need a pardon to rebuild his life. He's got a very comfortable life. But pardons now are as rare as hen's teeth, whether you deserve one or not.
Former Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. has been waging a national campaign to get a pardon for himself. And the number now, I think, is 77 million Americans asking Joe Biden to pardon 77 million non-violent offenders that have served their sentences, to use the adage, paid their debt to society, but because they have this federal scarlet letter on their chest, to your point about Dave Winfield, they can't rebuild their lives effectively.
Right.
Now, and I'm glad you mentioned Abraham Lincoln, because as the Democratic Party is shaking its head in total confusion and befuddlement, I'll make up a word, about,
No, that's a good word,
about how they lost the election.
Yeah.
If Joe Biden were to pardon, I don't know about the 77 million, but maybe 76 million, there are a whole lot of folks. If we look at this from a political perspective, there are a whole lot of folks that would find their way to the Democratic Party the same way African Americans were Republicans, because for a very long time, that was the party of Lincoln, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation. This could be a new Emancipation Proclamation.
Oh, you are absolutely right.
And John Kiriakou would be one of those people.
I would be one of those people. You know, I was convicted of violating, I'm the only American who has been convicted of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1981. I was sentenced to 30 months in prison. I served 23 months. And I was also given 3 years of federal probation. That was cut to 2 years. I'm done. I paid my so-called debt to society. But the Justice Department also confiscated my federal pension. So I will have to work until the day I die. And I am forbidden, as every felon is in America, whether it's a violent felony or you were convicted of whistling at the whale, I am forbidden for the rest of my life from owning a firearm. And in addition to that, I wasn't allowed to vote. I had to apply to the governor of Virginia for a state pardon, even though I hadn't violated any state law. I had to apply for a state pardon, which I got, only to be allowed to vote again. So, I mean, it's not just that you get a prison sentence, you serve your time, and then you move on. You can never move on because these punishments last for the rest of your life.
I'm going to mention two books that I always mention in conversations like this. As an African American, and I was talking about the impact of the deindustrialization of America, there was a book by Sidney Wilhelm called Who Needs the Negro? Where he talks about, this was written in 1972, I think. He talks about the issue of what is to be done with the African American community. And the other book, which is of a similar point, is The Choice, written by Samuel Yett, The Issues of Black Survival in America. And I want to quickly see if I can put my hands on the section of in the first chapter where Mr. Yett, well, I don't have it highlighted in this copy, but the point is, he says, basically, to follow up on Wilhelm, who needs the Negro? Because he says all the water has been drawn, all the wood has been hewn, all the shoes have been shined, all the dishes have been put away. We have become obsolete people in the minds of the industrial and the elite in this country. So what is to be done with us since our services are no longer needed? And one of the answers to that question is incarceration. That's why that's why we make up 13% of the American population and something like 40% of those that find themselves incarcerated. So again, folks, 77 million. And in fact, this is from Kiplinger. According to a Kiplinger article, it's very likely that you or someone you know personally has had a family member or close acquaintance who's been convicted of a felony, meaning you could potentially know a felon even if you weren't directly aware of their criminal history. And later on in the piece, I think the number he now has cited is 77 million. And it's also important, John, to realize that he's commuted, he being Joe Biden, has commuted a number of sentences. That is not the same as a pardon.
No, that's a good point. And many Americans confuse commutations with pardons. A commutation is simply they just end the punishment. So if you're in prison,
get out of jail free
card.
Yeah,
it's a get out of jail free card, but the conviction still stands.
You're still a felon.
Exactly. You're still a felon. You'll always be a felon, and you have to deal with the fallout from that felony conviction. A pardon is forgiveness of the felony, and you literally get your life back.
Because you don't have to check the box anymore.
Exactly. And I'm so glad you said that, because that's something that escaped me. What you mean, check the box. This is a very important issue for those of us who have been convicted of a felony, is that when you fill out a job application, there's a box and it says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And you have to check yes. So there was this movement called the Ban the Box movement,
right,
to take these off of applications. That's all fine and good. You take it off. But there is this thing now called Google, where you just Google a person's name and it shows, that they've been convicted of a felony. So, that doesn't help anybody.
If you can give me a couple more minutes, because I connecting the dots here, I want to move to a separate area, but an area of expertise for you. And that is, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal how a Syrian rebel went from an American jail to seizing Aleppo. Once affiliated with Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, Jilani professes religious tolerance. Many have doubts. Abu Muhammad al-Jilani boarded a bus in Damascus in March of 2003, heading across the desert to Baghdad with fellow volunteers eager to repel the looming American invasion of Iraq. When he returned home in 2011 after a 5-year stint in an American-run prison camp in Iraq, it was as the emissary of Islamic State founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who I think you've had some dealings with. Jilani arrived in Syria with bags full of cash and a mission to take the extremist movement global. And Abu Muhammad al-Jilani is the same guy that the U.S. is now backing in Syria. I see some inconsistencies here. John Kiriakou.
Yeah, boy, there are some inconsistencies. Abu Muhammad al-Jilani is a longtime radical, the deputy to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS. He broke off from ISIS and went to Syria as the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria. He immediately attracted the attention, in a good way, of the CIA. The CIA began to fund Jilani. It'll take us an hour just to explain why. But to make a long story short, 2 weeks ago, 3 very senior State Department officials, led by Barbara Leaf, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, went to Baghdad to meet with Jilani. They announced that they were taking Jilani off of the State Department's terrorism watch list. There was a $10 million bounty on his head that has been removed. And now we are working with Jilani as the new de facto leader of Syria. But, we have to ask, and nobody's asking in the mainstream media, how the United States allies itself with Al-Qaeda under whatever name it wants to use, and thinks it's going to help build a new Syria. It doesn't make any sense at all.
You just said under whatever name it wants to use, because what I have been saying, and some of this comes from my having sat at your feet and listened to you, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's
HTS, Harakat Tahrir al-Sham, which is what it's calling itself today.
It's the same organization.
It's the same organization, led by the same people, with the same ideology. It's still Al-Qaeda. And, when I was in the CIA, our mission was to either kill or capture every member of Al-Qaeda.
You personally got a few
with these 2 hands. Exactly. And And now all of a sudden, no, we're perfectly happy to work with these people. And the Israelis are saying, oh yeah, we'll work with them. And the Turks are saying, yeah, we love these guys. We're going to fund them. And this is who we're going with.
But wasn't when Al Jilani's crew got seized power in Syria, weren't they chopping heads? Weren't they? I mean, they were literally chopping heads a couple of weeks ago.
Literally chopping heads. And another thing, too, there was a story in the New York Times not too long ago about a teenage boy, 15-year-old boy, who somebody overheard telling a joke that somehow mentioned the Prophet Muhammad. And they took him to the roof of a building and they threw him off and they killed him for telling a joke. So that's who these guys are.
So now there's another dot here that I want to connect. And that dot is Shamsud Din Jabbar, the U.S. soldier from Texas that rented a truck and drove the truck to New Orleans, to the French Quarter, and killed 14 people, injured 30 or 40. And folks, I'm making this point in no way, shape, or form to justify what he did, but we have to understand how the language is used and what this signals. So he had a ISIS flag on the back of his truck, had posted on social media some sympathies with ISIS. And with that, I heard Chuck Schumer on Meet the Press this past Sunday say he was ISIS. Well, as I've said to you all before, I'm a 49ers fan, and sometimes I wear 49ers gear, but you won't see me on the field in San Francisco playing for the 49ers. John, it's almost as though they use the term ISIS when it's convenient to instill fear in the American public.
Oh, you are 100% right. There's literally zero evidence that this guy was ISIS, Shamsuddin Jabbar. He's from Houston. Houston is not a city known for its large Muslim population, right?
It's not Dearborn, Michigan.
It's not Dearborn, Michigan. Exactly right. What little evidence has been released shows that he was likely self-radicalized, which is quite common on YouTube. You can sit and watch YouTube videos all day long and, start shouting Allahu Akbar at the end of the day. He had an ISIS flag, which you can buy on eBay, in his truck. He actually had it upside down, which shows that he didn't even know what the heck he was doing. But Chuck Schumer just throwing out ideas that, he was a member of ISIS. Based on what, Einstein? What do you base it on that he was a member of ISIS? Did he have an ISIS membership card in his wallet? Or are you just throwing that out there to inflame people? Honestly, I've looked at this as best as I could. And this just seems to be a guy who was disturbed. He felt outside the societal mainstream. He self-radicalized and he committed a criminal act. I don't think there's very much more to it than that. I think this wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't ISIS. It wasn't Al-Qaeda. It's just a guy who committed a criminal act. It was terrible. He probably would have gotten the death penalty if he had lived and if he had been tried and convicted in the state of Louisiana. But I'm not seeing much beyond that.
But before I move to the next data point in connecting the dots, you use the term self-radicalized because that's another term that is bantied about, and I don't know that it has truly been defined.
Yeah.
So, and it seems to be used very conveniently when they want to label, when they want to paint with a very broad brush, again, and invoke or instill fear
Yeah.
in American people. Your thoughts on that point?
Well, we've had a lot of Americans who have been self-radicalized, and literally what they do is they just sit all day and watch YouTube videos that have been made by foreign radicals, members of Al-Qaeda, members of ISIS. They make these videos in Syria and in Yemen and in London, which is a problem. Yeah. And they become radical on their own. They haven't joined a terrorist cell here in the United States. They haven't gone through military training. They just become radical because they watch these videos all day long, and they come to believe in the content of the videos.
Now, I want to connect one more dot here. And the dot that I want to connect here is Matthew Allen Leibelsberger, the Army Green Beret who deployed twice to Afghanistan, lived in Colorado, left notes saying the explosion of the Cybertruck a couple of hours after, on New Year's Day, Shamsuddin Jabbar drove through the streets of the French Quarter, saying that the explosion was a stunt meant to be a, quote, wake-up call, end quote, for the nation's troubles, according to officials. I bring this up to contrast the way Leibelsberger is now being portrayed. This has almost become, in some forums, a discussion about PTSD.
Yeah.
And whereas Shamsuddin Jabbar, he was troubled. He going through his third divorce. His business was failing. He wasn't able to pay his mortgage. He was a troubled person. And again, folks, this is not to dismiss or diminish the horrific act. But if Leibelsberger can be suffering from PTSD, and we're supposed to find a way to understand his actions as a disturbed individual, why isn't the other disturbed individual? Why is he a terrorist and Leibelsberger is a troubled, misunderstood, tortured soul? Is that a fair question to ask?
It is, actually. Veterans commit suicide literally every day. It's many. I've seen 6, I've seen 10. One particularly horrific statistic is at least one veteran commits suicide every day in a VA hospital parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they do that because the PTSD is so severe, and the VA has utterly failed veterans who desperately need mental health treatment. So Leibelsberger killed himself in Las Vegas by blowing up his Tesla Cybertruck in front of the Trump Hotel. It happened on New Year's Day, which was the same day that Shamsuddin Jabbar killed 14 people in New Orleans. And so people immediately drew a parallel. Oh, this was maybe a coordinated terrorist attack. It wasn't.
Mm-hmm. They even rented their vehicles from the same website.
Yeah, from the same website, which I had never heard of until that day.
Right. But I was aware that there are people that rent their private vehicles.
Yeah.
And so this is a place, especially a place you can go if you want if you want to ride around in a high performance vehicle. If somebody has a Ferrari, that they're willing to rent you. But I never knew the name of the website.
Yeah, this is the Airbnb of vehicles.
Of vehicle rental.
Yeah, crazy thought. But
yeah, because you ain't getting in my car. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. This is an apples and oranges situation. First of all, Leibelsberger is a Trump supporter. He's a registered Republican. He had no beef with U.S. foreign policy. This was all about the federal government in the form of the Veterans Administration or the Department of Veterans Affairs falling asleep at the switch when it came to taking care of veterans. This was his end of life protest.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that he didn't take anybody else out with him. But to me, this was a mental health crisis. And Shamsuddin Jabbar, to me, was a criminal act meant to kill as many people as possible as he killed himself.
But still a mental health crisis.
But still a mental health crisis. And, another thing that this is, apropos of nothing that we've talked about so far. But one of the things that we should be, I think, a little frightened over is the fact that once Leibelsberger killed himself, Elon Musk was able to have the car unlocked remotely so the FBI could get to it, and was able to download all of the data from the car's hard drive remotely. That scares the crap out of me.
Hence Cybertruck.
Yeah. That's not a good thing.
And they were also able to track his movements by the recharging stations that he went to from Colorado to Las Vegas.
That's exactly right. I don't like that at all.
No. Wow. Well, John Kiriakou, Happy New Year, man.
Happy New Year. It's good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure. And yes, I will be looking forward to having you back.
Looking forward to that as well. Thanks.
Folks, I want to thank John Kiriakou for joining us today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episode tomorrow. In fact, tomorrow is going to be Dr. Linwood Tawhid is going to join us tomorrow. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. You can follow us on social media. You can find all the links below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.